I'm Jim Fernandez, Associate Professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese here at NYU. And on behalf of CLACS, I'm honored to be here today to introduce Roberto González Echevarría, Sterling Professor of Hispanic and Comparative Literatures at Yale University. In preparing for this introduction, it was the last line on Roberto's CV that first caught my eye. Quote, Roberto González Echevarría is a private pilot with an instrument rating, end quote. Upon reading this line, I was brought back to one of the first times I ever met Roberto in 1988, when I first learned of his interest and expertise in aviation. I had been invited to Yale to give a job talk, and after the lecture and campus visit, Roberto was driving another colleague and me to dinner, to a restaurant he had chosen in the nearby coastal town of Guilford, Connecticut. Now remember, this was way before the times of terrestrial GPS devices, and I remember getting a distinct feeling that Roberto may have gotten a bit lost. After all these years, I'm still stuck with an image of Roberto driving down the dark roads of coastal Connecticut, sitting up tall in the driver's seat, even craning his neck, trying to get oriented. At one point, he finally turned to me and confessed, Chico, sé llegar por avión. My friend, I know how to get there by plane. And then he explained to me that he very often flew over the Guilford Harbor in his training flights as a pilot, and his flights as a pilot. It was probably at that same dinner that I learned of one of Roberto's other surprising extra academic interests, baseball, and his vast and still ongoing experience as a baseball player, and more specifically as a catcher. Now, I'm sure I won't be the first or the last to see in this striking juxtaposition of two extracurricular activities, piloting planes and playing the position of catcher, a figure of sorts of the intellectual character of our distinguished guest. There's a kind of special perspicacity in both figures. We should remember that in baseball, the catcher is really the only player on the field who has all the other players in his field of vision, or at least their faces. One, the pilot gains insight by soaring, the other by crouching. And one of the truly distinctive characteristics of Roberto's vast and diverse obra is, I think, the coexistence of these two ways of seeing, these two ways of knowing. Take your pick of any of his many, many books, from Calderón y la Crítica to The Pride of Havana, A History of Cuban Baseball, from The Voice of the Masters to Celestina's Brood. In any one of these masterpieces of scholarship, you will find vast erudition combined with common sense and humor, impressive theoretical flight informed by dusty archives and old-fashioned philological work. From the technical expertise and aerial perspective of the soaring pilot to the grounded know-how and almost rooted vision of the crouching catcher, it would seem that nothing is alien to this passionate and voracious and learned man. Please join me in welcoming Roberto González Echevarría.
Thank you very much, Jim. I don't know whether I can follow up with a lecture that lives off wit of yours. I am going to be giving the lecture and at the same time manning this device here to be able to show you the quotes. But now that you know that I can fly airplanes, I cannot claim to be a hapless professor. But I'll do my best. Although this is, I don't know if it is relevant, this is part of a book that I've finished called Cuban Fiestas. The most significant literature and art to emerge after the avant-garde were associated with the poet and cultural promoter José Lezama Lima, the central figure in a movement organized around Orígenes, the influential magazine that he co-directed with José Rodríguez Feo between 1944 and 1954. Lezama's work and that of many of his associates began in the late 1930s as Cuba emerged from the Depression and many artists and intellectuals, among them the writer Alejo Carpentier and the painter Wilfredo Lam, returned from Europe, fleeing the end of the Spanish Civil War and the impending World War. The fall of the dictator Gerardo Machado and the abortive revolution that followed it in 1933 led to a certain recovery and stability under the guidance of Fulgencio Batista, who ruled as head of the army while puppet presidents succeeded one another and the frustrated revolutionary groups fought amongst themselves. Toward the end of the decade, a kind of national unity was achieved. A constitutional convention in 1939, composed of members of most political factions, drafted the very progressive 1940 Constitution, which was enacted as Batista took power after a legitimate electoral victory in which he was supported by a broad coalition that included the communists, who would have two of their own in his cabinet. In addition to the returning Cuban artists and intellectuals, there arrived in Cuba a host of Spanish exiles, professors, doctors, intellectuals, artists, who would have an immediate and lasting impact on Cuban culture. They found on the island the numerous Spanish immigrants who had come during the first 30 years of the Republic, many of whom had done well and created powerful economic and social institutions. Some of these and their descendants were partial to Franco and his newly installed dictatorship, but that did not prevent the exiles who were fleeing his regime from being well received on the whole. Batista was not favorable to Franco, which helped him. Many of the newly arrived and arriving Spanish intellectuals and writers were disciples of the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset, who had a substantial following in Cuba and throughout Latin America. This made their integration smoother. Their impact on Lezama and his group was decisive, specifically through the figure of the great Spanish poet Juan Ramón Jiménez, who spent time in Cuba in 1937 and took a liking to the young Cuban poets of the moment, for whom he became a guide. If an overarching principle had to be named as defining Lezama's group, it would be transcendental nationalism, the search for the essence of Cuban culture, not in race or history, but in and through poetry and art. Lezama did not partake of Afro-Cubanism, nor did he indulge in the exaltation of the white guajiros, the peasants, as the source of nationality, though he occasionally used the traditional stanza, the decima, in his poetry. He sought a higher synthesis into which the various cultural components would have already been absorbed, with the result that, unlike Afro-Cubanism, his work and that of his associates, including the great mulatto poet Gaston Vaquero, is devoid of exoticism. This does not mean that Lezama and his group were pure poets, or that their art eschewed Cuban social reality or history, but rather that these were interpreted by a hermeneutic seeking to discover their poetic essence. Lezama and many of his friends were Catholics, and although certainly not pious or orthodox, their approach had a Christian foundation, and their attitude toward life, which was on the whole optimistic, was of Christian origin. While they were evidently heirs to the avant-garde, they did not share that movement's nihilism and negativity, and they were decidedly opposed to existentialism, the philosophic trend that emerged after World War I, that had, through the works of Ortega y Gasset, a disciple of Heidegger, and later through Jean-Paul Sartre, great influence in the Spanish-speaking world. The Ortega y Gasset, Lezama, and others favored was an earlier one, whose main influence had been Oswald Spengler. They also rejected Freud, the pillar of the avant-garde, who did not have widespread influence in Latin America. Transcendence through poetry, that is art, was their goal, the discovery and achievement of beauty through an immersion in the nation. The Cuban fiesta, particularly in Lezama's writings, was a central topic or motif, in some measure because it could lead to a sublime sense of delight and the possibility and achievement of resurrection in the poetic as a way of resurrection in the poetic as a way of defeating death but also and concomitantly because the fiesta comes folded within the transcendental understanding of time. I have a report here that I am not going to read about a resurrection from Lezama. Though a poet, Lezama's greatest and best-known work is his novel Paradiso, published in 1966, but in the making since the 40s. One of his chapters appeared in a 1949 issue of Orígenes. It is one of the most audacious and original texts published anywhere in the 20th century. In contrast to Carpentier's, Lezama's artistic development cannot be charted against the backdrop of the evolving avant-garde movements like surrealism. He seemed to work oblivious to literary fashions, and he wrote in a style that shocked the likes of Julio Cortázar, the Argentine writer, who said that upon reading Paradiso he exclaimed, "One cannot write like that." Such was Lezama's apparent untutored naivete. Cortázar was right. Lezama wrote in a style that was prelapsarian, devoid of guilt and before the emergence of the law, ignoring grammar, the rules of style, and good taste. It is a mixture of kitsch and the sublime. This stance is one with his poetics and philosophy of life, which was profoundly Christian, as I've said, in its inclusiveness and with his view of Cuba as a festive nation. Fiestas are not only frequent in Lezama's fiction, but his entire poetic system is predicated on the concept of the festive. In fact, one of Lezama's best-known lines of poetry, which graces his tomb in Havana's Colón Cemetery, is "La mar violeta añora el nacimiento de los dioses, ya que nacer aquí es una fiesta innombrable." Or the purple sea, I think that's an allusion to Cuba, the purple sea longs for the birth of the gods, because to be born here, that is in Cuba, is an unnameable fiesta. The festive for Lezama shares with poetry a quality that he considers essential to both, and that he called lo hipertelico, or the hypertelic, from the Greek hyper, superior or excessive, and telos, end or goal. The hypertelic is that which goes beyond the end, beyond the telos, absorbing it, destroying it, I would say illuminating it, as it emerges from it. It is in the hypertelic that the image, which is the basis of poetry according to Lezama, reveals itself. Elements that constitute the fiesta are like it: poetry, music, dance, sport, eating and drinking. They are not predetermined by anything and partake of the hypertelic. These activities obey no specific need, are not guided by a definite intention, and do not try to reach a specific goal. Like beauty, which all of them contain in some measure, the hypertelic is self-sufficient, yet fundamental to the structure that they surpass, defining it backwards, as it were. The hypertelic is at the foundation of Lezama's Baroque aesthetics, which is an aesthetic of excess. This concept has much in common, precisely, with Georges Bataille's notion of excess, and even, I would say, with Jacques Derrida's supplément, being that which going beyond the system paradoxically characterizes it from its borders, or actually from beyond them. Lezama's excess, however, though homologous to Bataille's notion of expenditure, which to him is the violent residue of Hegel's and Marx's dialectic, is its correlative opposite. Bataille's orgiastic potlatch is a destructive feast, driven by his obsession with shit, and eschatological scatology, as it were. In the end, Bataille's system, I'm sorry for the word, but I can't avoid it. In the end, Bataille's system is a metaphysics of shit, if such a thing is conceivable. Lezama's excess, on the contrary, is a festive incorporation of the material, a communion with an abundance whose existence is to be celebrated. Derrida's supplement is more abstract. It was applied at first to writing, seen in the West, as he claims, as a suspect, parasitic supplement to the oral, which is presumed to be the carrier of truth, being allied to the pneuma, to the breathing spirit. But writing, from that exile and vulnerable position, revealed through its inner workings, difference, the impostures of the oral and the impossibility of achieving knowledge or the revelation of being through language. Lezama's excess joyfully brims over the limitations of language by means of a doctrinal act of will, a faith whose validity is untouched by corroboration, preferring to remain in the realm of the poetic. These hypertelic activities are related to another decisive concept in Lezama, which he draws from his Christian foundation. Resurrection, you already saw that quote. Lezama often insisted, charmingly, that man is not for death, as Heidegger had proclaimed, but for resurrection, which for him meant a rebirth through poetry. The fiesta, an amalgamation of all the basic customs and practices of Cuban culture, is a joyous celebration of this triumph over death. In this sense, all of Lezama's work are a fiesta, including his massive Paradiso, which constitutes a victorious creation sparked by a tragic misfortune, the death of the father in the fiction, which is, of course, also the death of Lezama's own father in real life. Paradiso is an autobiographical Bildungsroman that narrates the sentimental and artistic education of José Semí and the history of the Semí family in the wake of the death of Colonel José Eugenio, an officer in the Army of the Republic who died of an unspecified illness in Pensacola, Florida, while on training exercises with the U.S. Army. Semí, a boy when the beloved colonel dies, grows up in the care of his mother, grandmother, and uncles. We follow him through his education, his acquisition of a coterie of friends, some of whom are intellectuals and aspiring poets, his sexual awakening, and eventually his entrance into the university. The novel ends as Opiano Licario, an enigmatic poet who witnessed the death of the colonel, conveys to Semí a poem that ignites his own poetic imagination and makes him fit to begin again, the final words of the novel. There are obvious echoes of Goethe, Proust, and Joyce in this story, particularly of the latter's portrait of the artist as a young man because of the Catholic context of Semí's education and his poetic inclinations, and those of his friends. At the same time, there is also a good deal of Ulysses in the minute descriptions of Havana and the protracted discussions about literature and philosophy among Semí's friends. This is merely the narrative frame of the novel, which describes Cuban everyday life in ever-accumulating details and luxuriantly chronicles the development of the family as its center shifts from the deceased father to Rialta, his widow, and Semí's mother. The historical context of the novel, though not precise, is a suitable backdrop to what is, apart from its style, fairly conventional. It is the early decades of the 20th century Havana, when Lezama, who was born in 1910, was growing up. But Paradiso displays frequent passages of bravura or of elevation in the sense of Longinus' Sublime, in which apparently insignificant objects or activities are highlighted with great intensity, acquiring symbolic meaning. Among these are family dinners, food, drink, dress, sexual organs and acts, games, all of which are described in a style that never makes concessions to clarity or brevity, or reflects the relative dignity or importance of its subject matter. It is a style that is Lezama's signature, and the same in which he spoke in real life, regardless of situation. Lezama always spoke in Lezama, and there are countless anecdotes. For instance, his usual greeting was, ¿Qué tal de resonancias? Getting any vibes? And many anecdotes that I will tell you some after that. The noble's language is consistent with Lezama's relish of sensuality, which he opposes to death with a cornucopia of pleasures, physical, metaphysical, and artistic, in a language that acts as if it were itself a form of resurrection. It is, in a word, festive, and fiestas play a prominent role in Lezama's poetics, particularly lavish dinners or Baroque banquets, on which he focused in one of the lectures collected in his book of essays, La Expresión Americana, which is from 1958. Through the microcosm of the Semí family, which because of the marriage of the colonel to Rialta also includes the Olayas, Lezama endeavors to create a summa of Cuban culture. In fact, because the Semís are involved in sugar and the Olayas in tobacco, their union is a kind of allegory of Fernando Ortiz's thesis about Cuban culture being the counterpoint of tobacco and sugar, the title of his famous 1940 book. Moreover, Semí is not a Spanish surname, much less Basque, as the characters allege, and which Lezama is, but the Taíno word for their stone idols. Semís were the three-cornered figures that the Taínos, the original inhabitants of Cuba, worshipped. There are other suggestions in the name, such as Sema, unit of meaning, and Soma, body, but Semí in Cuba is a Taíno deity about whom we learned at school, not through any kind of veneration. With this word, Lezama invokes the prehistorical origins of Cuba, an origin, of course, more poetic than anything else, as the Taínos were exterminated thanks to the arrival of the Europeans at the end of the 15th century. What remains of them, other than many, many words, are archaeological curiosities. Lezama himself claims that the first Cuban poetic expression was a metaphor used by Columbus when he referred to the Taíno women's hair as silky as a horse's mane. First Cuban metaphor. As an origin, Semí is more poetry than historical reality, but that is precisely why Lezama uses the name. Like Vico, who had a profound influence in Latin America, yet to be studied, Lezama believed that a people's poetic conception of themselves, their mythological or epic origins, was an important part of their history. By calling the family whose history constitutes the central story of Paradiso Semí, Lezama endows the novel with an allegorical dimension. The microcosmic group's vicissitudes represent the origin and evolution of the microcosmic society in which they are embedded. Cuba is to Paradiso what Ireland is to Ulysses and Florence to Dante's Commedia. The protagonist's growth leads him to acquire a poetic knowledge of himself and the world, which highlights the primacy of the self-contained allegorical conception of poetic language as the key to comprehending the world. Fiestas, as mentioned, are a key component of Lezama's poetic universe. They serve as keys to his understanding of Cuban culture and of culture and poetry in general. The festive in all its sensuality and struggle against death endows matter, most significantly the body, with a transcendental dimension expressed through poetic language. Lezama's fiestas display all the main features of the event viewed from an anthropological perspective. They mark a transition, being a moment of unity and dispersal. They occur at special places and time, involve a variety of activities, the principles of which are eating, drinking, music, and dancing. There are two fiestas that I consider crucial in Lezama's conception of the Cuban fiesta, because they establish a counterpoint between the domestic and the public, between the home and the street as privileged sites. A counterpoint that illuminates his comprehensive conception of Cuban culture, both in its intimate and public manifestations. These fiestas are the family dinner that takes place in chapter 7 of Paradiso, and the carnival scene that is the focus of the poem El Coche Musical. Both take place in Havana, the first in the home on Prado Boulevard, where the widowed Rialta, Semí's mother, has moved with her family after the death of the colonel, and the Parque Central, the elaborate park to which the center of Havana was moved after independence in 1902. Now that the colonel is gone, the house is the Olaya's household. Chapter 7 of Paradiso narrates José Semí's passage from boyhood to young adulthood. The novel has 14 chapters, so 7 marks the turning point to the end. The chapter centers on a family reunion and dinner and on the charismatic, iconoclastic, and iconic figure of Uncle Alberto. A ne'er-do-well who squanders money on gambling and other vices, he serves to the protagonist as a counterpart to the dead father. Uncles are supplemental fathers, often looking like them but being devoid of their menacing authority. Uncle Alberto, who is killed in a car crash at the end of the chapter, is like the Joker in all senses of the word. In dying, he becomes the principal scapegoat of the feast celebrated in the chapter. The turkey that they eat is his double or emblem. Described in loving detail, the family dinner is, as mentioned, the principal scene of the chapter. It is one of the most memorable in Lezama's oeuvre, which has even given rise among writers and intellectuals to the expression una cena lezamiana, a Lezamian dinner, to allude to any copious feast. If you remember the movie Fresa y Chocolate, when the two protagonists get together to have a great feast, they're going to have un almuerzo, una cena lezamiana, to become part of the culture. With a Balzacian eye for economic detail that one would hardly expect of him, Lezama describes a house that, because of its location on Prado Boulevard, its elaborate doors, windows, inner patio, and multiple rooms, bespeaks of past glories in colonial times. Yet the fact that the upstairs is usually rented out reveals that the owners are no longer wealthy. There are, for instance, squabbles in the family because of the financial assistance that Leticia, a sister of Rialta who lives in the provinces in some comfort, provides the widow. Grandmother Augusta scolds Uncle Alberto severely because he shows up infrequently and then only to ask for money, which he proceeds to squander. She still gives it to him. Fine china and an elaborately embroidered tablecloth are brought out for the dinner, with explicit indications by the narrator that they hark back to an era of splendor no longer known by the family. Rialta anxiously awaits the mailman who will deliver the check with the colonel's pension. It arrives to her relief as the chapter ends. This is the house prepared for the feast that will celebrate the coming together of faraway members of the family, like Leticia and her husband Santurce, a doctor who lives in Las Villas, a central province, and Demetrio, a dentist who now lives in Havana in modest circumstances, and whose wife is a mulata whom he married on the Isle of Pines, where she ran a pool hall. All these representatives of various social classes gather in the Prado Boulevard house, brought together by the ritual organized by Doña Augusta, the maternal, that is Olaya, grandmother. The time of this fiesta is also significant. The dinner takes place on a stormy November evening, drizzly, windy, and with large waves pounding the seawall of the Malecón, the seashore drive on the edge of the Gulf of Mexico, not far from the house. It is appropriately an autumn ritual, one marking with forebodings of death the impending arrival of winter. Although the turning of the seasons is not as important in the Caribbean as it is in the northern regions, there are vestiges of autumnal rituals that derive from the Spanish Catholic tradition. In early November, for instance, the Day of the Dead is observed, not with the grandiosity of the ritual in Mexico, but the Dia de los Fieles Difuntos, or Day of the Faithful Dead, as it is called in Cuba, is an important holiday. All this underscores the presence of death at the dinner and in the entire chapter, as well as the role the house plays in providing shelter and refuge to this clan that is soon to scatter again. Like all fiestas, this celebration marks both reunion and dispersal, people who come together for the occasion but part ways, often through death afterwards. The narrator alerts the reader to this. This is the quote that you have on the screen. The family dinner, mingling gravity and simplicity, and warned them that the time for discretion had come. This ominous quality of the dinner makes the time of the reunion especially worth seizing and elevating. It is a time that celebrates itself, as it were. The signs of impending departures are everywhere, just as the cancerous tumor of the beloved grandmother Augusta, Uncle Alberto's dangerous adventures in a bar in which he tangles with a Mexican charro who is a figure of the devil, and eventually his death. But the presence of death at the dinner is also evident in the animal flesh and vegetables being consumed and the conversations they elicit. To be sure, conversation is a significant component of the dinner, both as a festive activity in which the guests display their rhetorical skills and wit, as well as the ways by which their words invest the food with meaning. The dinner is, needless to say, lavish. It includes 6 courses: a plantain soup, a beet salad, a seafood souffle made with prawns and lobster, a roasted turkey, a frozen cream for dessert made with grated coconut and pineapple, and fruit. These dishes are lovingly described with commentaries on their color, shape, and sources. Eating in Lezama is a poetic process by which matter is metabolized into flesh, making of the feast a collective communion, whereby in eating the same foods, all become one substance. Hence, eating these meats, seafood, vegetable, and fruit, all products of Cuba's nature, make the dinner guests, more than family, one with the motherland, and one in flesh and spirit. When speaking, Lezama always used the word incorporar instead of comer in normal conversation. To mean eating. He says, voy a incorporar, meaning I'm going to go eat. Of course, to consume this fish and fowl, they first have to be killed. They have to die to be reborn in those who consume them, just as legumes and fruit must be transformed in the passage from field or orchard to the dinner plate and the stomachs of the diners. This sequence from death to life is brought out in the conversation in 3 ways. First, when one of the children refers to the turkey as a sopilote, and is corrected by Semi, who explains that the proper Mexican word for the bird is guajolote, if a Mexican word is to be used. Someone adds that sopilote refers to a carrion bird whose Cuban name, aula. He declines to even pronounce because of its ominous connotations. The prawns are next addressed, and it is mentioned that Cuban fishermen believe that when these animals feel the nearness of death, they let themselves be carried by the current to a place where they join many others whose bodies make up the coral foundations of the island of Cuba. Here, the metaphor of eating as a metabolic process is clear. They are partaking of the nation's material foundation. The third is more complicated and noteworthy. Uncle Demetrio awkwardly knocks a slice of beet onto the fine cream-colored tablecloth, making 3 very visible, embarrassing red stains on it. It was then that Demetrio blundered as he cut his beet. He lost the whole thing, and while he was attempting to recover it, the untimely pricked red ball began to bleed. Demetrio trapped it for a 3rd time, but it broke and slid away. Half was stuck to the fork and half, with a new malign insistence, laid its wound once more upon the delicate cloth, which soaked up the red liquid with slow avidity. As the ancestral cream color of the tablecloth mingled with the beet's monsignorate, 3 islands of bleeding showed up among the rosettes. Monsignorato, of course, refers to the cardinals. The suggestion of blood could not be clearer. Uncle Alberto comes to the rescue, jokingly trying to cover the stains with the shells of the prawns already consumed by him and José Semi. But in spite of the mirthful turn he gives the accident, the ominous sign of the red spots on the tablecloth are evident. In the way the threads absorb the vegetable blood, the three stains open up in somber expectancy. Unquote. The announcement of Alberto's death, lodged in this apparently trivial accident, is fulfilled at the end of the chapter, after the taxi in which he's riding smashes into a train, hurling Alberto's face against the windshield and snapping his neck. The railroad guard who approaches his prone body took a handkerchief out of Alberto's pocket, of which from lack of use the iron squares could still be seen, and he covered Alberto's face with it, but the blood was still pouring out and followed the careful creases down to the corner where his initials had been delicately embroidered by Doña Augusta. Like the tablecloth's fabric absorbing the bead's juice, the handkerchief absorbs Uncle Alberto's blood. This textile image binds together the text of the chapter and seals, as it were, its festive theme. Alberto is the scapegoat of the fiesta. He, the charming chosen one, who embodies life and poetry, is the sacrificial victim. It is the price extracted by death for the revelry, its revenge for the affront made by the lavish dinner in flaunting the unity of the family. We might say that Alberto's death is embedded in the fabric of the fiesta, pun intended, revealing the tragic element of Cuban or of all human culture. For Semi, the death of this supplemental father signals the beginning of his adult life. Henceforth, he will become increasingly involved with his friends. Although still within the family home, he will make the city more and more his world. The mysterious figure who appeared in the bar room fracas between Alberto and the Mexican, the darkly attired Octavio Licario, will become his new guide. The family dinner proved to be the ritual of dispersal conjured up by the unity that it celebrates. It is the bright and dark center of the novel, its chiaroscuro play of light and dark. If in Paradiso, the fiesta is an intimate family ritual celebrated within the home, in El Coche Musical, first published in 1960, Lezama focused on a street carnival, a festival, the once famous Havana Carnival, taking place not just outdoors, but in Central Park. Whereas in the 19th century, depictions by Landaluce and Mial of the Fiesta del Día de Reyes, Havana's hub was then the Plaza de San Francisco, the docks. The center of the capital's urban life is now the Parque Central, the space that embodies civic society and represents by its location, building, and monuments the powers of the state. The next move of that center will come later to La Rampa, and it appears in the novel Three Trapped Tigers, by Guillermo Cabrera Infante. So Plaza de San Francisco, Parque Central, and La Rampa, I follow that in my book. Built in 1903, just after the proclamation of the Republic, Havana's Parque Central is nothing like its counterpart in New York, which being a large green area, owes much to the fashion of English gardens. Havana's Parque Central is very European. It's a very European public square that celebrates the new nation in paving stones, masonry, and concrete. There is a statue of national hero Jose Marti in the middle of the park, palm trees, symbols of Cuban nationality, and imposing buildings all around. These are edifices that boast of the nation's prosperity in the early decades of the Republic, such as the huge and lavish Centro Gallego, with the National Theater next to it, as well as the Hotel Inglaterra with its Louvre Café, and famous portals on the ground floor facing the Parque Central. The Centro Gallego or Galician Center was the palatial building erected by the numerous Galician population of Cuba, or the numerous Galician population of Cuba. It rivaled the Centro Asturiano, Centro Vasco, and Centro Español, whose equally ostentatious structures located nearby have been erected by other Spanish regional groups. The Louvre Café was the favorite meeting place of poets and baseball players in the 19th century, the acme of Havana's cosmopolitanism. One corner of the Parque Central Square led to the Manzana de Gomez's block, a pedestrian mall that housed many elegant stores. The parque itself is located at the head of the Prado Boulevard, where the Olaya's house is situated, which leads out toward the sea and the Morro Castle guarding the entrance to the bay. The Prado was named after the one in Madrid, of course. The Blue Sea and the Morro's lighthouse can be seen from the balconies of the Inglaterra Hotel. This fusion of public spaces connotes continuity, for the Prado was the boulevard on which the ostentatious carriages of the Cuban elite paraded in the 19th century, as depicted in Cirilo Villaverde's Cecilia Valdés and Frederic Mial's famous Prince. The Parque Central, more compatible with the automobile era, boasts of Havana belonging to an international world of travel, American tourism, and European immigration. Lezama could not have chosen a setting more representative of the modern Cuban nation for his fiesta poem. The timing, of course, need not be elaborated upon. It is carnival season, the season of revelry, relaxation, inversion of customs, rules, and mores, taking place just before Lent, when prohibitions will return with exceptional rigor and remain in place for over a month. During the early decades of the Republic, the Havana Carnival achieved great splendor with floats and comparsas. These are dancing quadrilles that Carpentier once called an ambulatory ballet, parading through the street of the city. It was not quite New Orleans, but it competed favorably with the renowned Santiago Carnival, celebrated on the eastern end of the island. In the poem, which is narrative in structure, Lezama has placed a leading figure.
I had a picture of Icarus.
The protagonist who presides over the proceedings, the composer, musician, and band leader Raimundo Valenzuela. He was a prominent and popular mulatto performer from San Antonio de los Baños, who was instrumental in the creation and dissemination of the danzón, the first popular form of Cuban music, which bound together social classes and races with its alluring rhythms and capacity to incorporate melodies from a great variety of sources. El Coche Musical is dedicated to Valenzuela's memory. It is noteworthy that Lezama should have focused on Valenzuela, whom he portrays as a key figure in the fulfillment of an all-encompassing Cuban cultural synthesis. He was a dark mulatto, probably from the colored petty bourgeoisie that had emerged on the island during the 19th century, and a musician, as were others of the same background, including his father. Lezama did not engage in identity politics, much less racial ones, but his poetic insight about Valenzuela's significance in combining elements from various levels of culture in the creation of his popular art, an art for the masses, makes of El Coche Musical a poem whose importance transcends its aesthetic merit. The first canzón was composed and played by another mulatto musician, Miguel de Faide, in Matanzas in 1879, same year that one of the most famous early baseball games was played in Cuba. A coincidence that I reported in my book on Cuban baseball. It was derived, the danzón, from a mixture of the French contredanse, or originally the English country dance, brought to Cuba by Haitian colonists fleeing the revolution, as well as African rhythms and melodies absorbed pell-mell from a wide range of sources, including operas like Rigoletto, Tosca, and Madame Butterfly. Everyone danced danzones, even in the fiestas after baseball games, in which Valenzuela's band often performed. It was in great demand for those fiestas that took place after baseball games. Valenzuela also composed canciones, rumbas, guarachas, and he even wrote some zarzuelas, and was active in the struggle for independence from Spain. As far as I know, Lezama is unique in his awareness and celebration of Valenzuela's prominence and decisive historical role. His inspiration was based on a childhood memory. Before reading El Coche Musical in a recording of his poetry, made by Casa de las Américas, Lezama says the following. I remember that when I was very young, maybe I should give you the Spanish since I'm reading the English. I remember that when I was very young, towards the end of the year, when carnival time came, Central Park acquired a festive animation that was truly vertiginous. When carnival came, then the park was surrounded by little orchestras, and when one waned, the next one started up in such a way that the Central Park Square was constantly animated, sparkling with light. There was a true street party atmosphere. And then Valenzuela, who was fine-looking with his taffeta frock, would go from orchestra to orchestra as if giving each the beat. And then at once the orchestra started up with his Cuban sonnets. And this made a great impression on me, because I saw the music relentless, as if it were fire, mobilized music emerging from each of the four corners of the park. Valenzuela gave me the impression of being Orpheus, who would be supplying the flute's melodies, the harmonies, numbers. And that impression, with the passing of time, endured within me until one day I wrote the poem, The Musical Coach, in remembrance of Raimundo Valenzuela and his carnival orchestras. Aside from the fact that Lezama conflates the year's end holidays with those of the carnival, which arrived 3 months later, one problem with this poignant reminiscence is that Valenzuela died in 1905, and Lezama was not born until 1910. Could the carnival scene be something that a family member related to? Could the Raimundo Valenzuela he remembered be really his brother Pablo Valenzuela, who took over the orchestra? Most likely. I have not been able to answer this question, and Lezama is not available. I'm sorry for the question. But it does not really matter. What is significant is how Lezama transmutes this childhood recollection into a poem about fiestas, and what he does with the figure of Valenzuela, whom he turns into Orpheus, thus offering a stunning dramatization of Cuban culture in the making. El Coche Musical follows Valenzuela as he triumphantly rides around Central Park in his horse-drawn carriage, deploying his 12 orchestras, which presumably correspond to the signs of the zodiac. This is the first of several cosmic connections. He goes from one to another, infusing each with energy and music as he performs other activities, such as magnanimously distributing cigars, assessing the value of a piece of fine cloth by the mere sound of the rustle of pleats, sweetening what appear to be balls of cotton candy, creating pillars and pyramids of sound that reach up to the stars. Valenzuela is in possession of the secret code, the Pythagorean numbers, whose combination establishes cosmic correspondences between the earthly and the heavenly, the mundane and the astral. It is in the cipher that encrypts the key to the music of the stars, wherein the festive Cuban time is lodged. This measured time, this music, can confront death because it is a full synesthesia of colors, light, sounds, flavors, and rhythms that is presumably innate to Cubans and prepares them for their journey to the afterworld. I cannot resist quoting the original. Around the park in his carriage, dispensing avisos pitagóricos, Pythagorean clues needed to enter into the cosmic accord, wherein death can be at least temporarily vanquished. The clues are, needless to say, musical, and the proper response to them is dance. For Valenzuela's music is no abstract sound to be enjoyed in self-absorbed solitude, but music created for dancing, because, this is a great line, bailar es encontrar la unidad que forman los vivientes y los muertos. To dance is to find the unity binding the living and the dead. This is a material, carnal accord of bodies, matter, sound, rhythm, and cosmic links involving all the senses. Thus the allusions to cigars, food, and drink, and the projected scapegoat, that Cuban figure dancing in his journey to the afterworld. Could that be Uncle Roberto? The depiction of matter, literally concrete or stone, melting Dalí-like, as in the last words of the poem, la cornisa que se deshiela, the cornice that melts, adds to the sensation of a softening process. This is a world that is more like molasses in its consistency than hardened substances. In this bubbling mixture, hierarchies are abolished. Everything has its own dignity and significance as it is sucked into the creative vortex of Valenzuela's entrancing music. He presides over a universe in flux, oblivious to fixed categories, such as distinctions between high and low art, between classical and popular music. In his danzones, as mentioned, Valenzuela often adapted tunes from opera and other forms of European music. It is clear to me that Valenzuela, a heroic figure, is a persona of Lezama himself, and his poetics of Baroque accumulation. In developing the danzón, the mulatto composer and musician found a Cuban musical blend that binds the population, regardless of class or race, in moments of ecstasy in which, by forgetting themselves, they remember a lost unity. This is the reason why Valenzuela can parade himself, sashaying in his fancy taffeta frock coat, commanding respect and admiration from all, and obedience from his musicians, whom he conducts with verve and convictions. Larger than life, Valenzuela is a fabulous figure, a hero. El Coche Musical, in fact, begins with a correction in that regard. Its first line reads, "No es el coche con el fuego cubierto, aquí el sonido." It is not the carriage covered with fire, here it is sound. That is to say, it is not Phaeton's chariot shrouded in flames, or a carriage radiating music, a kind of roaming calliope. Valenzuela may be no Phaeton, but he too is a mythological figure. Orpheus, who, while not setting the world on fire, will by filling time with measured sound crack the mysteries of fate to prepare his fellow revelers to confront death. Orpheus is a god chosen because he crossed death's limits, and lulling Hade's gatekeepers, Pluto and Persephone, with his music, descended in to rescue Eurydice. The poem's impenetrability is like the music of the danzón. It is melodious, rhythmical sound without an ostensible verbal meaning translatable into rational discourse. Since to Lezama, Valenzuela is Orpheus, his music is orphic, prophetic, ritualistic, and mystical, like El Coche Musical. Even then, there are flickers of meaning. The overall narrative structure can be grasped, and some of the obscure allusions can be ultimately deciphered. These are clues that situate the poem in a specific Cuban geographic and historical context, linking the contingencies of Cuban culture to the broad cosmological resonances suggested by Orpheus and his music. For instance, a place referred to as Las Lágrimas Compostelanas, Compostelan tears, must be the Centro Gallego, Galician Center, the imposing building of the Galician Mutual Aid Society already mentioned, Santiago de Compostela being the capital of Galicia. There is something of a condescending smirk in the phrase, as Galicians were mocked by Cubans because many were uneducated peasants who spoke a somewhat garbled Spanish. It is not their native language. They are also seen as being modeling, hence the tears. Mention of the gaiteros or bagpipe players is also a jokingly mocking allusion to the Galicians, as they are known for playing that mournful instrument. There is some Cuban humor too in El Coche Musical, in consonance with its carnival atmosphere. La Querida de White, or White's Mistresses, is a reference to José White, ironically giving his name, another mulatto musician of great renown in Cuba during the 19th century who triumphed in Paris, and who was also a composer of both classical and popular music. The recovery of all these oblique but specific traces adds to the enjoyment of the poem, but does not alter its principal effect, which is to provoke in the reader an emotion comparable to that of music, the fiesta innombrable and unnameable sublime fiesta. El Coche Musical is a carnivalesque poem about the carnival. The Havana Carnival, performed as a celebration of national communion. At its deepest level, it is a poem about poetry and transcendence, the poetic fiesta that encompasses all fiestas. Lezama's writings have contributed to our knowledge of Cuban history and culture. His highlighting of Raimundo Valenzuela's significance, for instance, is an original contribution to our knowledge of the history of Cuban culture. Lezama underlines the sacred nature of certain common practices that we take for granted: fiestas, foods, and family reunions. These are also insights of the highest value whose importance has extended beyond his group of followers and admirers. Lezama's judgments about figures in the history of Cuban literature are also unique and have been influential among critics and scholars. But although Lezama's poetic fiestas have had an impact on younger writers, particularly on Severo Sarduy, they are an end in themselves, a culmination. They are not a probe into Cuban culture that yields any applications, being, in a sense, inimitable. To enjoy them, one must allow oneself to be carried away by their powerful allure, suspending not so much disbelief as the desire to know and understand rationally. Lezama is a writer of the stature of Proust, whose vision and language absorbed reality, creating with it another world that once one enters it feels coherent, total, and sufficient. It is not an alternative or parallel world, it is the only world. The greatest pitfall of Lezama criticism is to be sucked into that world and produce commentary that is either a pale reflection of Lezama or at worst a parody of Lezama. Much of the criticism devoted to his work has fallen into this trap. It is easy to do. To resist Lezama, however, may be tantamount to resigning oneself to not understanding him, to be left out of the fiesta altogether. To take an ironic distance feels like a profanation. Besides, from what secure vantage point might one cast an ironic glance that is not as arbitrary or predicated on a faith, even a nihilistic one, as Lezama's? What I have done here aspires to be the isolation and interpretation of a topic or recurrent scene in Lezama, but as happens with every detail of his work. To tease it out means to bring the whole along with it. In that sense, I too have failed to hold Lezama off and have joined with my halting steps the dance. Thank you very much. Absolutely, yes. I don't know if I give it an answer. Yes.
Yes. I've just been reading a fair amount of Lorenzo Garcia Vega in Los Años de Orígenes,
Yes.
and he takes that ironic approach to Lezama Lima. He says that he can never forgive Lezama for that line about the fiesta innombrable. That it's like that, that in a sense is sort of like to occlude the fact that life in Cuba, at least as far as Garcia Vega puts it, was not all that great. That they were kind of trying to put this, that the Origenistas in a way, and he admires them, were kind of trying to put too good a light on things. And so he says that the whole thing with the familia venida a menos, the family that's come down in the world, he says he's got a real problem with that. That it's kind of like remembering this sort of aristocracy and this kind of, self-image that the Origenistas and Lezama in particular wanted to portray them as a seaver poor, but we used to be great. And in a sense, it's that sort of irreverence, I think, that's sort of a necessary counterpoint to Lezama, in a way, when he gets too grandiose.
Yeah, well, Los Años de Orígenes is a very polemical book from which I learned a lot when I read it many, many years ago. And one has to take into account a couple of things. That Lorenzo Garcia Vega is a very minor writer, and that he's writing about a truly major writer. But the background that he gives I find very useful because, in fact, Lezama's family, his own family, these are the details that I get from the book, was of a certain stature, and came down with the death of the colonel, which was in some ways lucky for the colonel and the family because it saved him from the humiliation of Batista's coup in 1933 by the enlisted men that brought down the whole of the brass of the Cuban army which had been trained like Lezama's father by the United States Army and so forth. So I'm fascinated by all of that. I read Garcia Vega with a certain ironic distance myself, and learn from it. And there have been other critics. I mean, in fact, Guillermo Cabrera Infante, and why not Roberto Padilla, in the early years of Lunes de Revolución, took a very anti-Lezama attitude and mocked Lezama and this and that and the other. This happens with the passing of the generations. But I have handled a copy of Tres Tigres that Guillermo sent to Lezama with a great description and all of that. So one has to take that with a grain of salt. But they were attacks. I mean, it is a whole long history that I don't know if we have time. But I mean, there was a break in 1954 between the two Josés, Rodriguez Feo and Lezama Lima. It's a major, crucial point in the history of Cuban literature, because Rodriguez Feo was very rich and paid for Orígenes. And so when they broke, Lezama was left broke, and he was able to produce one more Orígenes. At one point there were two Orígenes and all that. And he founded a magazine called Ciclón, which is more avant-garde, less Catholic, less transcendental, and all of that, which was the one that morphed into Lunes de Revolución. Nevertheless, El Coche Musical appeared first in Lunes de Revolución. So it is all con familia, as it were.
Yes.
I have a humble question for a historian. So to take it with that in mind, I was struck just hearing the way you described someone describing Havana, or describing Carnival, describing the car, describing the Centro Gallego and right down on the corner. It seemed to me a little bit like almost in an archive of Havana rituals and daily life in Havana. You mentioned Gabriel Infante later in those pieces of theaters, but one of the things that struck me looking at chapter 7 before your talk was the way it starts with the description of that door, and how it's relatively imposing for the colonial period, which then took me to Cecilia Valdez, which began, I think, pretty early on her descriptions of these colonial doors. And I was just wondering if you could talk to me kind of as an habanero, as someone, as kind of a major interpreter of Havana, material life in Havana, whether you think a comparison to Villaverde and Cecilia Valdez is meaningful in any
very.
Or looking forward then.
Very. It's very, very, very meaningful. And oh yes, he really mythologizes Havana in the way that Joyce does with Dublin. And that description of the door is a magnificent description. It's the beginning of the chapter, so the door, the beginning of the chapter opening up. And there's a whole symbolic meaning behind all of this, these descriptions of the door. And of course you have to realize, as I tried to mention, that this is a house that has come down. That is a house that is almost a ruin, as it were, of the houses that were on the Paradiso Boulevard by the time that Lezama describes it, which is the time when he was growing up. And some of that area of Prado, very near where Lezama would live, later became whorehouses in the Calle Colón, which is nearby. So yeah, he's mythologizing Havana, as I said, in all its minute details, elevating the symbolic. As I don't think any other writer, perhaps Borges or Buenos Aires, has done in the Latin American tradition. Guillermo Cabrera Infante does it in his own way, but not, in my view, Lezama does it. Cabrera Infante suffered from what my friend Bloom calls the anxiety of influence, a very acute case of the anxiety of influence. So he had trouble with both Carpentier and Lezama, whom he parodies, of course, in the Tigres. Two of the parodies are of one of Carpentier and one of Lezama. So yes, you can go from Sicilia to Paradiso to Persistes Tigres looking for these images of Havana. It would be a great thing to do. It's a great project for a book, including the Havana of El Acoso by Carpentier, and taking into account Carpentier's marvelous essay La Ciudad de las Columnas, where he describes Havana's colonnades and so forth. So it is not a humble question, it's a very important question because you, as a historian, you have seen the continuity. Yes. Any other? I can go on forever on these writers.
Any other questions?
Yes.
I was wondering what brought you to the study of Lezama and the scheme of the fiesta in the first place, because as you were talking, I was thinking about how, if maybe the idea of abundance was illusory and people of the 40s are certainly not. You don't think of abundance now, and this theme of family reunion now that families are.
Well, compared to now, there was a lot of abundance in the 40s. Yeah. Well, if you want to ask my own interest, I've always taken a kind of anthropological interest in literature. I think that my interest in the fiesta is a combination of both its literary allure as representation and also my anthropological interest in the event and in the actual start of the book and of the topic is much more mundane. I was invited to a symposium in Paris by a center that, I'm sorry for the Caribbean people, I'm sure I can assure that it's called El Clical, Centre de Recherche, when I tell my friends that I went to a symposium in Clical, they think that I'm having some sort of a sexual fantasy. But it was on the topic of the fiesta in Latin America. It's a very important topic throughout Latin America, particularly in the countries that were large viceroyalties, where feasts, the imposition of the Catholic calendar on major cultures like the Aztecs and the Incas took a great deal of effort on the part of the Spaniards and those cultures themselves. So I was invited, and I decided to speak on Cecilia Valdés, on Ortiz, Villaverde, Ortiz, and Carpentier. And of course, Cecilia Valdés is the plot of Cecilia Valdés goes from one big fiesta to another, and so that was my entry. Ortiz learned from Cecilia Valdés. Ortiz was an anthropologist who got his material from literature, a great deal of it. And so I studied his own essay on the Fiesta del Día de Reyes, which is a major essay on the topic. And then I studied the Fiestas in el Siglo de las Luces by Carpentier. And that is what led me to this whole interest in fiestas. I combined it then, of course, with my interest in baseball, because I'm interested in the game as ritual and as a festive ritual. And I had studied in a chapter of my baseball book called The Cuban Belle Epoque, the confluence of the origin of baseball and of Cuban music, and also of Cuban literature, of modernista literature, because I claim that baseball is a modernista sport. And so I brought in, so that's how it all somehow got together and led me to this. So then I've done a chapter that I published in the Yale Review that some have seen on the representation of the Fiesta del Día de Reyes in painting, in Mial, in Andaluce, and in one cigarette wrapper in which the fiesta is. And then, well, I'm not going to tell you the whole thing about the book, but that's how I came to it. I think that ultimately, in me, it all goes back to Carpentier. I learned most of what I know really Carpentier.
Okay, if there are no more questions,
Yeah, what?
how do you see if there's any the transformation of Lezama's fiesta in today's Havana with the crisis, and did it more both the landscape of the city and the behavior of the people?
Fiestas are older than politics.
Yes.
Baseball is older than Cuban politics. It's been there since 1864. So, in spite of the crisis, and in spite of the repression, people do have their own fiestas of some kind or another. I have only been able to track them in film, and of course in film they appear very often. The fiesta is very, very prominent in Fresa y Chocolate, for instance. And one that is going to, the name is going to elude me now, which is about the Tropicana nightclub. I don't know if any Cuban film expert here can remember it. Paradiso. It's a wonderful film. It's a wonderful film. And there you see, it's a film based on mostly on Cabrera Infante and Sargui, I think, and Sargui, that's a wonderful film where the festive remains, or at least its representation. And the nightclub, of course, I studied the nightclub because the nightclub is the privileged side of fiestas in the literature of the 40s and 50s, particularly in Cabrera Infante. And I came to a figure through Cabrera Infante that I sort of end with in my chapter on film, but that deserves the book, and his name is Rodney. I don't know if anybody knows who Rodney was. Rodney was the choreographer of Tropicana. He's the one who orchestrated and organized all of these marvelous numbers for Tropicana, which were a mixture of everything, including ballet and so forth. He was a kind of tragic figure, but with great accomplishment. He made a great deal of money. He was openly homosexual. Cabrera Infante says that Rodney was the first man he ever saw kissing another man in public. He was a leper. He suffered from leprosy and was routinely picked up by the police because they were afraid that he would. In a way, I finished my book thinking, damn, I should have written a book on Rodney. So I think that it continues in spite of the scarcity, because, as I said, the fiesta is more important than politics and economics and all of that.
We're all invited to the reception outside.
Around the park in his carriage, dispensing avisos pitagóricos, Pythagorean clues needed to enter into cosmic accord, wherein death can be at least temporarily vanquished. The clues are, needless to say, musical, and the proper response to them is dance. For Valenzuela's, music is no abstract sound to be enjoyed in self-absorbed solitude, but music created for dancing, because, this is a great line, bailar es encontrar la unidad que forman los vivientes y los muertos. To dance is to find the unity binding the living and the dead. This is a material, carnal accord of bodies, matter, sound, rhythm, and cosmic links involving all the senses. Thus the allusions to cigars, food, and drink, and the projected scapegoat, that Cuban figure dancing in his journey to the after-world. Could that be Uncle Roberto? The depiction of matter, literally concrete or stone, melting Dalí-like, as in the last words of the poem, la cornisa que se deshiela, the cornice that melts, adds to the sensation of a softening process. This is a world that is more like molasses in its consistency than hardened substances. In this bubbling mixture, hierarchies are abolished. Everything has its own dignity and significance as it is sucked into the creative vortex of Valenzuela's entrancing music. He presides over a universe in flux, oblivious to fixed categories, such as distinctions between high and low art, between classical and popular music. In his danzones, as mentioned, Valenzuela often adapted tunes from opera and other forms of European music. It is clear to me that Valenzuela, heroic figure, is a persona of Lezama himself, and his poetics of Baroque accumulation. In developing the danzón, the mulatto composer and musician found a Cuban musical blend that binds the population, regardless of class or race, in moments of ecstasy in which, by forgetting themselves, they remember a lost unity. This is the reason why Valenzuela can parade himself, sashaying in his fancy taffeta frock coat, commanding respect and admiration from all, and obedience from his musicians, whom he conducts with verve and conviction. Larger than life, Valenzuela is a fabulous figure, a hero. El Coche Musical, in fact, begins with a correction in that regard. Its first line reads, "No es el coche con el fuego cubierto, aquí el sonido." It is not the carriage covered with fire, here it is sound. That is to say, it is not Phaeton's chariot shrouded in flames, or a carriage radiating music, a kind of roaming calliope. Valenzuela may be no Phaeton, but he too is a mythological figure. Orpheus, who, while not setting the world on fire, will by filling time with measured sound crack the mysteries of fate to prepare his fellow revelers to confront death. Orpheus is a god chosen because he crossed death's limits, and lulling Hade's gatekeepers, Pluto and Persephone, with his music, descended in to rescue Eurydice. Their poem's impenetrability is like the music of the danzón. It is melodious, rhythmical sound without an ostensible verbal meaning translatable into rational discourse. Since to Lezama, Valenzuela is Orpheus, his music is Orphic, prophetic, ritualistic, and mystical, like El Coche Musical. Even then, there are flickers of meaning. The overall narrative structure can be grasped, and some of the obscure allusions can be ultimately deciphered. These are clues that situate the poem in a specific Cuban geographic and historical context, linking the contingencies of Cuban culture to the broad cosmological resonances suggested by Orpheus and his music. For instance, a place referred to as Las Lágrimas Compostelanas, Compostelan tears, must be the Centro Gallego, Galician Center, the imposing building of the Galician Mutual Aid Society already mentioned, Santiago de Compostela being the capital of Galicia. There is something of a condescending smirk in the phrase, as Galicians were mocked by Cubans because many were uneducated peasants who spoke a somewhat garbled Spanish. It is not their native language. They are also seen as being modeling, hence the tears. Mention of the gaiteros, or bagpipe players, is also a jokingly mocking allusion to the Galicians, as they are known for playing that mournful instrument. There is some Cuban humor too in El Coche Musical, in consonance with its carnival atmosphere. La Querida de White, or White's Mistresses, is a reference to Jose White, ironically giving his name, another mulatto musician of great renown in Cuba during the 19th century who triumphed in Paris, and who was also a composer of both classical and popular music. The recovery of all these oblique but specific traces adds to the enjoyment of the poem, but does not alter its principal effect, which is to provoke in the reader an emotion comparable to that of music, the fiesta innombrable, an unnameable sublime fiesta. El Coche Musical is a carnivalesque poem about the carnival. The Havana Carnival, performed as a celebration of national communion. At its deepest level, it is a poem about poetry and transcendence, the poetic fiesta that encompasses all fiestas. Lezama's writings have contributed to our knowledge of Cuban history and culture. His highlighting of Raimundo Valenzuela's significance, for instance, is an original contribution to our knowledge of the history of Cuban culture. Lezama underlines the sacred nature of certain common practices that we take for granted. fiestas, foods, and family reunions. These are also insights of the highest value whose importance has extended beyond his group of followers and admirers. Lezama's judgments about figures in the history of Cuban literature are also unique and have been influential among critics and scholars. But although Lezama's poetic fiestas have had an impact on younger writers, particularly on Severo Sargüi, they are an end in themselves, a culmination. They are not a probe into Cuban culture that yields any applications, being, in a sense, inimitable. To enjoy them, one must allow oneself to be carried away by their powerful allure, suspending not so much disbelief as the desire to know and understand rationally. Lezama is a writer of the stature of Proust, whose vision and language absorbed reality, creating with it another world that once one enters it feels coherent, total, and sufficient. It is not an alternative or parallel world, it is the only world. The greatest pitfall of Lezama criticism is to be sucked into that world and produce commentary that is either a pale reflection of Lezama or at worst a parody of Lezama. Much of the criticism devoted to his work has fallen into this trap. It is easy to do. To resist Lezama, however, may be tantamount to resigning oneself to not understanding him, to be left out of the fiesta altogether. To take an ironic distance feels like a profanation. Besides, from what secure vantage point might one cast an ironic glance that is not as arbitrary or predicated on a faith, even a nihilistic one, as Lezama's? What I have done here aspires to be the isolation and interpretation of a topic or recurrent scene in Lezama, but as happens with every detail of his work. To tease it out means to bring the whole along with it. In that sense, I too have failed to hold Lezama off and have joined with my halting steps the dance. Thank you very much.